Could you elaborate on this idea of government and its role, the role that it plays in any sort of free society?
Yeah, so I think, see, one way to look at the role of the government is that there is this belief that capitalism needs to be regulated, and that is the role of the government, right? So capitalism has its excesses, and the government should be basically, so if the government were to do a good job at regulation, then capitalism is an all positive kind of system. So in theory, while that might be a proposition, like we've just spoken, that because there is so much economic power, once the way capitalism operates, there is also a concentration of both corporate power and money power. So in any industry across the world, you could see that uh, maybe 3 or 4 players have 70% of the market share. So inherently, capitalism leads to a concentration, a centralization of economic power, of production. So how it actually pans out in practice is, like we've seen, that the politicians and the government also needs money, and the corporates have money, and they use this money effectively to blunt out the possibilities of regulation. And in fact, now if you see what is called neoclassical economic theory, or what is neoliberalism, the dominant economic theory over the last 40 years, even the theory is saying that you should not be taxing the rich, you should leave the money in the hands of the rich. And so whatever possible redistributory role a state could have played, which used to happen in some of the successful social democracies, is being undermined by theory itself. So whether it is buying up of legislation to just work in the favor of corporates, or to remove the possibility of the state having some kind of a redistributory, equalizing kind of a role, that is going away. So in that sense, I think, in fact, and not only that, in the new regime where we have this international kind of a porous capitalist global order, governments are increasingly powerless in their countries. So like, you can't even make legislation because there's a larger capitalist world order of the WTO, IMF, etc. To use more fancy terminology, I would say that political jurisdictions and economic jurisdictions don't overlap anymore. So the government of India doesn't really have as much economic power over the jurisdiction of India as it had, say, 40 years back. So all these are implications of how governments are ideally supposed to have a certain role of balancing, of equalizing, of doing good for their larger population, but how capitalism undermines all this and renders governments increasingly powerless to do real good for their people. I would say, I would put it that way, actually.
If we were to flip the script a little bit, you mentioned power, the word power. We've seen in history, when governments, when the state has power over redistribution, how that can go haywire. A recent example is Lebanon. So Lebanon, for its early, for like around 20 years, the government was like the redistributing factor, and they had control over the central banks, even the private banks, and they had a lot of, essentially they had a lot of power, and they misused, and corruption was pretty much a blanket statement there. Do you think centralizing power to the government again has an inherent flaw, which you could call it a feature in its own way, right? A socialist system. The government would misuse it. And capitalism, even though there are examples of 70% like monopolization, there is like a decentralization of power, which has its own flaws. But do you think if you flip the switch, you'd still get a very similar outcome?
Yeah, so I think that's a good question. I don't know much about Lebanon, but that question can be seen in the context of the socialist experiments of the 20th century. So whether it was the USSR or China, they basically looked for a more equal society, a redistribution that was led by the state. And we also know that that came. So instead of economic power being concentrated, these experiments have a history of political power being concentrated, and people's political and civil rights completely being smothered. So you're right that as long as we have some kind of a centralized entity that is not accountable, that you can't question, that you can't change, I think we will end up with similar outcomes or maybe even worse outcomes in some cases. So while there needs to be an equality in society in terms of material outcomes, possibilities, etc., I think if I were to use a phrase that might not be appreciated, we need to look for, I will say, more democratic versions of socialism. So how can we have these questions of how will our lives run? How will we have relatively similar outcomes, equality? How do we decide all this also collectively and in a very decentralized manner? So while socialism is a bad word in today's day and age, I think having learned from the experiments of the 20th century and now having seen the capitalist onslaught for 40 years, we need to think of better economic systems, but equally importantly, political systems in which real participation, a real decentralization is also possible. So I would say, I mean, if that is any kind of an answer to your question.
No,
Yes, I agree that concentrating political power does not solve the question of concentrated economic power. That's as bad or if not worse in some cases.